Is reading really the intellectual exercise that it's made out to be? As the internet increasingly dominates to the point that it's become synonymous with the 21st century, sitting down for long periods of time to read good old-fashioned books seems to be held in increasingly high regard as the exercise of choice for those who are determined to keep their attention spans long and their wits sharp. One of the most common New Year's resolutions is to read more books, and one of the most common Christmas gifts of the last few years has been the e-reader. But is this lofty regard for the written word actually well-founded? A year ago, as 2018 drew to a close, I realised that I'd only finished 5 or 6 books that year, and that most of those were only finished out of sheer determination. In other words, reading had become far from being a joy or a habit for me. And as someone who took the highest level of extension English in high school, with a mother who was a university professor of English and a wife who reads a lot of books, this made me feel kind of stupid. Although I'd immerse myself deeply into foreign language TV series and sometimes even formulate my thoughts into written reviews, I felt that the severe lack of completed books for the year and for most of my adult life must have been an indication that I was an intellectual toddler, incapable of concentrating on something that wasn't bright and moving. So I resolved to read 50 books in 2019, about one a week, and I got started straight away. I was staying at a holiday house with extended family, so I had basically full-time childminding, I had a peaceful country setting, it was perfect, and I powered through 5 books, and in particular I really enjoyed this by Dennis Lehane, which I almost got busted for shoplifting, even though I actually paid for it. That's a story for another video. Although my progress did slow, obviously, especially when I went back to work, until about June I stayed pretty close to on track to reach the 50 book goal for the year. But I was also uploading regularly to this channel about my passion, which is learning languages. So it would have been logical that I'd be reading about language acquisition theory, linguistics, the history of the Norse languages, etc. Right? Right. But the problem with the books that I should have been reading is that they would demand so much more time and attention, and together with my job, my family, learning 2 languages and uploading regularly to this channel, I couldn't give more than a few hours per week to reading, which meant that I would need books that wouldn't take more than a few hours to finish. Enter crime fiction. Now, don't get me wrong, I love crime fiction. I salivate over the thought of a beautifully intricate web of deception and alibis and motives such as is found in the best crime novels and TV series. That's why I started my second YouTube channel. But as I'm sure some of you have already realised, since crime writing isn't my professional field, and I obviously didn't find reading these books to be very challenging, reading like this wasn't doing anything at all for my mental capacity, and after the first few books, it wasn't really improving my concentration either. The problem was that even just staying on track for my goal was still making me feel like a smart guy. People would still be genuinely impressed when they'd ask me what I'd been up to that morning, and I'd say that I'd been reading all morning. Now, I realise that for some people, reading 50 books or even 10 books a year is going to be a huge step forward in personal development. Maybe you just tend to watch too much TV, maybe your literacy isn't what it could be, and that's making your job harder than it needs to be. If that's the case, then the last thing I want to do is to discourage you from reading more if it's going to move you forward. It's just that for me, it wasn't moving me forward. In fact, it was holding me back. There'd be times that I'd get a few hours spare that would be perfect for working on my French or my Swedish or maybe even writing a new video, but I'd be behind on my reading goal, so. Additionally, the books that it was taking me the longest to read were always those of the sort that I should have been reading more of, not less of. For example, The One Thing by Gary Keller, which is probably the best self-development book I've ever read, was taking me a day per chapter because I would take extensive notes, and it was aptly this book that finally convinced me to abandon the goal entirely, because all it was doing was distracting me from my real goals. Becoming proficient in 2 foreign languages and making the best videos that I possibly could about that topic. So I finally stopped letting my misguided idea of what makes a person smart cloud my vision, and I slowly pushed through the 2 books which have propelled me forward more than any of the other 38 that I read this year. The One Thing by Gary Keller, which I've already mentioned, as well as this, the first non-children's book that I ever fully read in Swedish. It took me about 3 times as long as a book of the same length would have in English, but given that I never thought I could make it through a whole book in Swedish, what it taught me was that some things are a lot more possible than you think, and that you may never really find out what you're capable of if you only ever hold yourself to ideals. Essentially, what I learned by trying this was what economist Charles Goodhart already knew, that when a measure becomes the target itself, it ceases to be a good measure. So when considering how much you want to read and how often, don't make the same mistake I did of equating prolific reading with productivity. Consider first what you want to get out of reading, and then which book or books might be able to help you with that. For me, the coming year will hopefully entail reading about 20 books, but that's 20 books in particular, and I'll be willing to change that again if they turn out not to line up with my overall goals. And I'd encourage you to do the same. Feel free to let me know what you're planning to read and why, and we'll have a little book chat, just you and I, and everyone else who can see it on the internet. If you like videos like this and you want to know how language learning can positively impact your life, then there's probably a way to mark the channel so that you don't forget it exists. I don't know, I'm not good at computers. And on that note, I'm going to go and read a book. Bye.